Yeah, so I'll do that again. Hi guys. So I reached my maximum recording time before, so I'll have to just completely start off. So what I was doing was I was talking about um, the story, which, and I really feel like I do need to do a little bit of an introduction here. So as part of research for my book, I was researching a little bit about different countries, and I think I've only got time to talk about one of them, and I'll talk about Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, as a lot of people may know, is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, if not the oldest, and they can go back to 4.2 million years ago. So the only places on Earth that claim to have older civilizations are Kenya at 6 million and Chad at 7 million, and that's only based on fossils. There's little written evidence that they were actually as old as Ethiopia. In fact, there's claims that perhaps people just moved the fossils. So Ethiopia is possibly the first civilization in the world, the first human civilization. And so there are a few people that dispute that. A little bit of, nationalism. But really in the scientific community, it's generally accepted to be true that Ethiopia and certainly parts of Africa is where people first came from. It's the cradle of humanity. And I mean, they did move to Europe reasonably early on, but places such as where I live in Australia, as well as the Americas, were uninhabited. So North and South America were completely uninhabited as far as humans were concerned at the time that humans were first living in Africa and possibly Europe. Now, there are some evidence that there was human civilizations in Asia as well, reasonably early on. I think China can go back as far as 1 million years ago, which is a long time ago. And I think Japan was 400,000 years. But yeah, so it's and that's a long time ago. But as long, the point of what I'm trying to say here is that I was looking for what the early names of Ethiopia is. Now we know that the first time they used the word Ethiopia, that was around the 6th century BC, so which is around 2,600 years ago, and basically that word means, it was a Greek word that meant burnt skin. Now for people not familiar with that, that's essentially a racist slur, or at least it would appear like that way to me. And so since that time, they've called themselves Abyssinia, Axum, Demut, and a few other names as well. But then they've reverted back to Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is not their first name. So they had other names before that. Now the earliest name I could find for them was simply called the Land of Gold. Now, you can dispute that a little bit, whether that was really referring to Ethiopia or perhaps Punt instead, or somewhere else even. But that's the earliest one that I've got. And there are certainly other earlier ones than Ethiopia, and the one that was around at the time of the Great Flood was was probably Habash, and that's 12,000 years ago. What they were called at different points, I'm not completely sure. So when I was looking through this, I came across a city in Ethiopia called Gondor. Now, for people familiar with Lord of the Rings, the name Gondor might ring a bell to you, because Gondor was one of the great human cities. Spelled a little bit different, probably pronounced a little bit different, but I bet you if I asked J.R.R. Tolkien, where did you get that name from, he'd probably say, oh, that's from Ethiopia. That was an early name used in Ethiopia. Now, the city in Ethiopia that's called Gondor was only called that in 1650 AD, so only 369 years ago. And I say only because in comparison to the 12,500 years ago we're talking about, or millions of years ago, that's a drop in the ocean. But when I looked up why did they call it Gondor, there's two things that it said. So one thing, it said this was an early name for Ethiopia as a whole. And that's not unusual. A lot of countries, when they change their names, they will then go ahead later on and name a city after the old name for the entire country. It can get confusing, but that's fairly common practice. It also said Gondor was the Camelot of Africa. And that's a strange thing, because if you think of Camelot, you might be thinking of King Arthur. And in the legend of King Arthur, Camelot is believed to be Tintagel Castle, or Tintagel, I might be saying that wrong, in Cornwall in England. And it's always been a bit of a mystery why they called it Camelot. And there's been different theories. It's based on a combination of different things. It's a metaphor and all this sort of. I mean, why not just call it Tintagel Castle or Cornwall? You know, that's one of the castles owned by the British family to this day. Why not call it that? And that's been a little bit of a mystery. Now, why? Then I've got the other question: why was Egypt calling itself Camelot? And yeah, I mean, it was implied that before it was called Gondor, that it was called Camelot. Now, what year? I can only guess. Certainly before it was called Ethiopia, and before it was called Habash. So if it was called Habash around 15,000 years ago, up to about 10,000 years ago, roundabout, then it was probably called Gondor before that. So let's have a guess, and we'll say 20,000 years ago. That seems like a long time. Some people will tell me humans didn't even exist 20,000 years ago. Well, they did. They existed in England in 900,000 years ago, and they were in Ethiopia 4.2 million years ago. So, yeah, it's just that we don't have reliable records of what they were doing at that time. So anyway, so Gondor 30,000 years ago. So if you're going to have a guess, you're going to say, when was it called Camelot? Perhaps, let's say 40,000 years ago, or 50,000. We can't be sure exactly. Now, another thing is that the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was said to contain records from all other countries under the Greek Empire. And some of those records were said to go back as far as 90,000 years. So they weren't from Egypt. Some of them were, but others, they were from all over the world. And they may have even been from places that were not under the Greek control. Now, Ethiopia was certainly under Greek control at the time. And so they would have been able to contribute their records to the Library of Alexandria. I don't know if they did, but they probably did for some of their records. And for people not familiar, so early books, what they were handwritten. So what we're talking about is, and the ones that were in the Library of Alexandria were written by one person painstakingly, and they might have done it personal pictures, and usually there was only one copy. Sure, that we all know the Christian Bible had lots of copies, but most books only had one copy. You might have two or three eventually if it was really popular and two people want to look at the same time, but usually just have one. One library would hold that book, and usually they wouldn't let you take the book out. You'd have to go to the library and read it in the library, and you'd have to pay a certain amount for the privilege of reading it, and if you damaged it in any way, you were expected to repair it yourself. Now, I mean, some people were allowed to take it out, but that was reserved for kings and such. So if we're having a story about Camelot in the Library of Alexandria, but a Camelot meaning Ethiopia, meaning land of the camels, which is probably a reasonable reason why they called it Camelot, we can say perhaps that story was very different to the story of King Arthur, but it mentioned Camelot, and perhaps, and this is my theory that I'm currently going with at least, is that whatever that story was, it probably involved a lady in the lake, a sword in the stone, and Camelot. It probably didn't involve crusades. It probably didn't involve, well, it might have involved Knights of the Round Table perhaps, but it probably didn't involve some of the England-specific parts of it. and perhaps England, when they were, because we know that in the 6th century AD they weren't particularly strong. England as a country was not particularly strong in world terms, and they certainly were nowhere near as strong as the Roman Empire. Nor was Ethiopia, incidentally. So that was one way for them to get back on the Romans, is to say, hey, you guys destroyed all of that information that was held in the Library of Alexandria, and we know Romans destroyed that. It was a Greek library in Egypt, if you can get that around that. And so when the Romans conquered Egypt, they destroyed it. They didn't do it all in one go, but they certainly by the 2nd century AD, or 3rd century, it was completely gone. And so 300 years later, these people could be saying, hey, we know about a story there. We're going to get back on you by saying, hey, we know this story. We're going to change it a little bit to adapt it to be an English story rather than an Ethiopian story. And we're going to say, we can do the same thing to you, what the Ethiopians did to whatever they did it to. You know, whoever they were attacking. Whether they were attacking Atlantis or some other place, I don't know. But I found the whole thing really, really interesting, and it's sort of it's a gap in human knowledge. You know, we know that most parts of the world had humans living in them before the Great Flood. Now, the only places that didn't, well, officially New Zealand didn't, Israel didn't, or at least they didn't call themselves Israel. Syria certainly did, and Syria included Israel at the time. And then we've got Norway, and the only reason that Norway didn't, or the Scandinavia, was because it was frozen over. And they may well have actually had humans there, but they may have died by the time of the Great Flood. But yeah, and Chile. So South America didn't have any humans in it. Even North America had a few. Not many, but a few. Because North America was settled around 35,000 years ago. Australia had a small population going back as far as 65,000 years ago. Maybe only a few hundred people in the entire country, but going back that far, they say. Although in the case of the Americas and also Australia, the majority of the population came after the Great Flood. Dramatically increased in size. And we know that, and same as most of the world. They call it the Great Migration, soon after the Great Flood. But we've got this massive gap. We're not talking about, oh, we missed a few hundred years. We're talking about, we know stuff all going back to the Great Flood. We know a fair bit going back 3,000 or 4,000 years. But then we've got a gap. We know little bits up to 12,500 when the Great Flood happened. And then we know almost nothing going back further than that. And we have this gap from 12,500 years back all the way, I mean, potentially to 7 million. That's the age of the fossil in Chad. So from 7 million to 12,500, we don't know what happened. We don't even really know what happened until about 6,000 years ago. And even then we're disputing it. And the world didn't start 6,000 years ago. I mean, the world, gee, that's billions. But, you know, humans, millions. Whoa. And there is a lot there. And I mean, some people say, well, why have you got dinosaurs? Well, no, sorry, why have you got dragons? Well, dragons are in every culture and religion on Earth. And they're not the same thing as dinosaurs. Don't know what's going on there. Anyway. So yeah, so that was something there. It's possible that the King Arthur legend could have been a combination of things that actually happened, but also based on a story from Ethiopia from perhaps 20 or 30,000 years ago, maybe longer. Might not be, but there's a chance. I thought that was quite fun, quite an interesting thought. Okay, bye bye.